Welcome to another class on Nehemiah chapter 12, 27 through 13:31. I've entitled this, Always Reforming by the Word. I think it's significant that in chapter 12 through 27 to the end of that chapter, we find kind of the high point or climax of Nehemiah's ministry and even that of Azariah's to the city of Jerusalem, the people of Judah. And in chapter 13, we see a lot of the reforms that took place in chapter 10 and 12 are having to be dealt with by Nehemiah in chapter 13. So kind of a downer, a need for reform again. Nehemiah's reformation of Jerusalem. Well, he's got a lot to be to boast about or crow about. He built a wall around the city that was destroyed, had been destroyed. He organized a people who had been survivors of exile. He was part of a revival that allowed the people to understand the law and to worship and celebrate a feast of booths not seen for 1,000 years. And the confession of sins by the people, and a renewed commitment also by the people, along with the organization, planning, and implementation of repopulating the city of Jerusalem. As Boyce suggests, few people have had as much to celebrate after a lifetime of hard work as Nehemiah had after less than a year as Judah's governor. Well, let's look at an outline of chapter 12, the second half. Well, it's a dedication of the completion of the wall. And there's a paragraph about the great choirs led by Ezra in verse 31 through 37. Then there's the other choir led by Nehemiah that begins in verse 38. And then there is a section making provisions for the temple staff in chapter 12, verse 44 through 47. Verse 27 begins the preparation. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgivings, and with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the districts surrounding Jerusalem and from the villages of the Netophathites, also from Beth Gilgal and from the region of Geba and Azmaveth, for the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. And the priests and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates and the wall. What was the timing of the celebration? It seems odd if you are familiar with the story of Nehemiah, because he finished the wall in chapter 6. And here's the dedication begins in the second half of chapter 12. Why? Well, chapter 12 is a climax to the book of Nehemiah, and for that matter, perhaps also that Ezra. The altar had been built, the temple had been built, the wall had been built, the people had reformed, the people are organized. Lots of kudos. He had completed the request or the commission granted by the king to rebuild the city and its walls. And it was proof to Nehemiah that it was God's good hand that was involved in this, but it was not just a wall. He also sought the welfare of the people in chapter 2, and his enemies recognized that and were upset about it. But one commentator puts it this way: it is clear from the book of Ezra and Nehemiah together that the walls are not an end in themselves. Yet had their official dedication come immediately upon their completion, chapter 6, precisely this impression might not have been given. More than a wall. Well, 27 through 30 show us some of the preparations for a joyful and thankful celebration. Well, you need a worship team, so they're gathered. That includes sons of singers. These were Levites who were singers and composers, for example, in the title of Psalm 50, I think it is. They were brought from regions, which is interesting because they had no tribal territory. So they lived in unwalled towns they had built on the fringes of settled places. It was inclusive. Surrounding Jerusalem is mentioned twice, but also are areas to the south, to the east, to the north, and northeast of the city of Jerusalem. Well, it was for dedication of people. And what did that look like? Well, the pattern had been that when you build an altar in the wilderness, you dedicate it. Solomon's temple, after building, was dedicated. Ezra's altar and temple, after being laid and built, were dedicated. So why not dedicate this wall? How did you do that? Well, priests, Levites, and people were purified or cleansed. Probably include washings of people and clothes, abstinence, perhaps fasting, and maybe some ritual sprinkling of blood from offerings. And the gates and walls are sprinkled with blood and sacrifices and water using a hyssop brush. So everybody was involved, which is probably a good place to talk about preparing ourselves for worship services, especially those who are the worship team or those who are leading the worship. They need to be holy. They need to be sensitive to that which would defile them or profane them. So do we. In verse 31 and following, we have two choirs. The first one is led by Ezra, and it starts this way. Then I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed two great choirs that gave thanks. One went to the south on the wall to the dung gate, and after them went Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah, and Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, and Jeremiah, and certain of the priest's sons with trumpets, Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, son of Mattaniah, son of Micaiah, son of Zechar, son of Asaph, and his relatives, Shemaiah, Azareel, Melalai, Gilalai, Mai, Nathaniel, Judah, and Hanani, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God. And Ezra the scribe went before them. At the fountain gate they went up straight before them by the stairs of the city of David, at the ascent of the wall, above the house of David, to the water gate to the east. Well, what about these choirs' roots? Well, leaders are brought up on the wall as well as the choirs. What was interesting is that some of the leaders, when the wall was built, would not stoop to serve the Lord and help with the building. That's found in 3, verse 5. And Tobiah himself, an enemy, mocked the wall, saying, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall, in chapter 4. Well, the wall was about 9 feet wide, so it must have been quite a fox. They left from the valley gate, and that's where Nehemiah's inspection of the wall at night began. You'll see, if you look to the left, there's a map of the city. You'll see 2 arrows coming out of the valley gate there. Let me read the other description, verse 38 through 43. The other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north, and I followed them with half of the people on the wall, above the tower of the ovens, to the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, and by the gates of Yeshanan, and by the fish gate, and the tower of Hananel, and the tower of the 100, to the sheep gate. And they came to a halt at the gate of the guard. So both choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the house of God, and I and half of the officials with me. And the priest, Eliakim, Maaseh, Miniman, Micaiah, Eloi, Zechariah, Hananiah with trumpets, and Maaseiah, Shemaiah, Eliza, Uzi, Johanan, Malchijah, Elam, and Ezer, and the singers sang with Jezreiah as their leader. And they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Well, one way to make sense of these processions, to see how they mirror each other. They're very similar. They're both called Thanksgiving choirs. They both have a lay leader. They both have half of the lay leaders. There are 7 priests with trumpets in both groups. Both groups had a music director. They both had 8 Levite musicians. their route. They both took a route to the house of God. One went right, the other went left. The leader of one was Ezra, and the leader of the other was Nehemiah. So how was the rejoicing heard far away? Well, it was God caused. One writer says this: note that the emphasis was on joyful praise on the part of all the people. Singing is mentioned 8 times in this chapter, thanksgiving 6 times, rejoicing 7 times, and musical instruments 3 times. Wow. Another author says the narrative has base. Who can skim past the dedication of the wall where there are choirs of people singing and dancing on the wall? They are yelling so loud that the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. Let it bump. As an aside, the musical instrumentation of the Israelites was much softer than that of the surrounding countries. Well, another paragraph, another step in reforming the worship, if you will, was making provisions for the temple staff in verses 44 through 47. On that day were appointed over the storerooms the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather into them the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. And they performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the command of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers. And they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. In a sense, they sang for their supper. Well, let's compare reforms. It'll help to see the overall flow of chapter 13 if we compare it to earlier reforms. Well, there was prohibiting foreigners in the assembly, in the worship assembly. That's found in Nehemiah 10 and also in Nehemiah 13, having to be reformed again. There was neglecting support of the temple in Nehemiah chapter 10 and having to be dealt with again in chapter 13. There was keeping the Sabbath holy by not working or buying or selling in chapter 10, and again reformed in chapter 13. And finally, there was marriage to peoples of the land, which took place in chapter 9 of Ezra 30 years ago, and then Nehemiah 6, Nehemiah 10, and again in Nehemiah 13. So let's look at the first reform that needed to be reformed: separation from all foreign descent, the first 3 verses of Nehemiah 13. On that day they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. So what do we mean by misapplying the reading of the book? Well, let's look at kind of the context first. The timing on that day was much later than their stipulations made for supporting the singers and the Levites in chapter 12. The occasion for this reading of the book was, well, they read from the book in chapter 8 and verse 1 and verse 13. In chapter 9, it was something they did, but not on any special occasion. And what they found was that no Ammonite or Moabite was to be a part of the assembly or the worship service ever in Deuteronomy 23. And the reason given, as was true in Deuteronomy, is that they did not meet Israelites with food and water, but hired Balaam to curse them. But God turned that around into a blessing when Balaam was unable to curse. So what was the issue? Well, it seems like perhaps the people went a little bit beyond the text, because it doesn't say prohibiting all of the people, but prohibiting Ammonites and Moabites. But they excluded everybody of foreign descent. They separated from foreigners when they assembled in Ezra 10, Nehemiah 9, when they gathered in the temple for religious practices. They didn't want foreigners as a part of that. Robert suggests that the Ammonites and Moabites to be excluded were those who did not repent of idolatry, and you may be thinking of Moabites, who in fact repented and joined the assembly. That would be Ruth, who turned from sin, confessed, and followed God. We're chapter 1. Carson makes this aside. Think of dear Ruth, great grandma to King David, if you please. Now they're out to restore great David's city, but we begin by excluding all Moabites. Well, how about some application? Going beyond the law in one area not only misapplies the law, but may lead to neglect in another area of the law. Look at Luke 11, being focused upon going beyond what was required of tithing by the leaders to ignoring mercy. Well, the people had committed to not neglecting the temple in chapter 10, yet here they doing just that very same thing, neglecting offerings, vessels, tithes for priests and Levites in verses 4 through 5. Nehemiah 13, 1 through 3 reminds us only true believers should be included in the community of believers if a sense of theological unity and purity of worship is desired. Well, the inclusion of pagans who might introduce foreign theological ideas and weaken the believer's total commitment to God is a concern, a danger of ecumenicalism. Well, let's look at verse 4 through 9. We've got a foreigner in the temple storeroom, an Ammonite. Verse 4, now before this, Elishib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king, and came to Jerusalem. And then I discovered the evil that Elishib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. Well, blood is thicker than bond or covenant or oath. The timing again is along with verse 1 before this, so it's back before the wall was dedicated or even prepared, people prepared to dedicate it. The occasion was after some time. We don't know how long Nehemiah was gone or when he left, but he was absent and with the king on this occasion, for this occasion or this opportunity. Well, the issue was that Elishib had done evil. Verse 13:1 said the Ammonites were prohibited from entering the temple ever. And furthermore, that no marriage of daughters or sons to the peoples of the land was part of their commitment. And yet Jehoiada, son of Elishib, married into Tobiah's Ammonite family. Which meant that there's no place to store material for the offerings, portions, or priests, Levites, etc. in the storerooms because Tobiah had reserved that room. So the Levites, singers, were forced to flee to their fields in order to provide for themselves. What was the cure? Well, expulsion of Tobiah, or at least his furniture, and then purification by the priests. Well, the temptation to compromise God's law takes many forms, doesn't it? There's the fear of man. In chapter 2 of Nehemiah, there's jeering, intimidation, false rumors of revolution. There's also false religion. A false prophet was hired to cause Nehemiah to sin and ruin his reputation. There were family and business ties between Tobiah and the nobles of Judah and the high priest. And here in chapter 13, there's toleration of sin. Lots of ways, lots of temptations to compromise, even in the book of Nehemiah and in our own lives. One more point to be made: the danger of choosing leaders based on favoritism and not scripture is a danger. Tobiah, in one of the temple storerooms, could oppose God's work while posing to assist it. Sort of undercover, if you will. Well, verse 10 through 14, the staff of the house of God is forsaken because of this movement by Elisha and Tobiah. Let's start at verse 10. I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" And I gathered them together and set them in their stations. Then all of Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, Pedaiah of the Levites, and their assistant Hanan, son of Zachar, son of Mathanan, for they were considered reliable, and their duty was to distribute to their brothers. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. Well, let's look at this, how Nehemiah fixes the forsaken house of God. Well, the problem was that because the Levites were receiving no portions from the tithes, they were forced to flee their fields to make a living, causing the house of God to be forsaken, as mentioned in chapter 10, verse 39. Well, the perpetrators are confronted in verse 11. The officials were reprimanded verbally and publicly in their posts of service. He also reprimanded nobles, verse 17, and those who had married peoples of the land. So we'll see this reprimand or this confrontation reappear again twice more. He begins that with a rhetorical question using the word why, but it assumes that the officials are guilty of the offense. There's a prescription in verse 12 through 13. As soon as the administration is fixed, the officials are dealt with, the people bring their tithe and offerings to the officials. And the priests, Levites, scribes, laymen who were reliable were made administrators to watch over, to oversee the distribution. Sounds like Acts chapter 6, verse 1 through 6. Verse 14, Nehemiah gives another of his remember me prayers. Well, it means to call to mind so as to act on that memory. And Nehemiah prays for God to remember him for the good things he did in verse 22, verse 29, and verse 31 of this chapter. But it's specifically concerning this, that is, confronting the officials about non-payment of Levites and establishing a better administration of system of tithes. In a negative request, he does not want them to be wiped out. It's like a book where writing could be erased. He wanted credit for it. credit for good deeds for the house of my God and for his service. So hesed means steadfast love or faithfulness to the commitment. So his own faithfulness to a covenant is what he wants to be remembered for, as well as his service, specifically exercising great care over the temple. Application. Laxity by leaders is infectious. Chapter 10 closes with the people's promise. We will not neglect the house of our God. While laxity in one area led to decline and stagnation in the others, as we see in chapter 12. Remember me was not a selfish request for God to make him famous or rich. He simply asked God to not forget his faithful love for God, which was exemplified in what he did to preserve the proper worship of God at the temple. Which begs the question, what do we do, or what are our motivations for our service to God? Well, another reform that needs to be reformed, the Sabbath, verse 15 through 18. In those days, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on the donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads which they brought into Jerusalem on Sabbath day. And it warned them on the day where they sold food. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah and Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel for profaning the Sabbath. Well, let's look at that. In those days, from the previous paragraph, the paragraph before, this infraction or offense is taking place before the dedication of the wall, so it's a flashback. Nehemiah makes an observation. He sees Judeans working with wine presses, loading and bringing merchandise to sell. He sees Tyrians bringing fish, dried, smoked, or salted to sell by the fish gate. So he warns the people. That means he brings witness against someone. It's a legal action. It has, in this form, the meaning of speaking against, of admonishing, or of chastening. And he goes on to confront the nobles, the ones responsible, and reminding them that the Sabbath breaking would bring the wrath of God, which was true of the exile. And he held the Jewish buyers responsible, not the foreign sellers. What do we mean by profaning the Sabbath? Well, by doing common things on the Sabbath, like shopping, buying, and selling, that made the day common. It was no longer special. Well, here's a quick history lesson from the Sabbath. Nehemiah gives 3 negative rhetorical questions about the history of profaning and is expecting his readers to agree. The fathers profaned the Sabbath. It brought disaster on us and the city from God. Therefore, acting like the fathers will bring wrath on Israel. Seemed like a pretty straight argument. And the indictment, of course, is you are acting just like your fathers and you are bringing wrath on ourselves as well. Well, the reforming of this Sabbath breaking in verse 19 through 22 reads as following. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. Well, Sabbath safeguards. Well, when it began to grow dark at the gates, the Sabbath began at sunset. And there are some precautions that were made to prevent profaning on the Sabbath. Kidner puts it this way: once more, remonstration is reinforced with shrewd precautions, and precautions with alertness and pugnacity. And Nehemiah has the wisdom to hand on this charge to those who should keep it, making sure that they accept it as a holy task, that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates. Verse 22. Well, he warned the merchants and sellers outside with a threat to attack with intent to harm or kill. And he ends praying, remember me this. Specifically, remember me this about restoring the Sabbath. So God was asked to remember Nehemiah's tested again, his covenant love. But here he asked God to remember on the basis of God's own compassion, that is, his sparing Nehemiah, and his loving kindness. So what about Christians on the Lord's Day? I often ask, is God more pleased with Eric Liddell from the movie Chariots of Fire in his refusal to play soccer or run races on the Sabbath, or with us and our turning Sunday into just another shopping day? We are free to enjoy the Sabbath, but enjoy it we must. Another reform that needed reforming was intermarriage with foreign women, chapter 13, 23 through 27. In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? And among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? Let's look at the problem of languages briefly. The language of Ashdod is not known to us. We suspect it may be a form of Aramaic, but the Hebrews recognize other people as foreigners by their languages. And Ashdod was not listed in the list of foreign nations in Deuteronomy 23. Could some of the Judeans have perhaps rationalized marriage to Ashdodites because it was not specifically forbidden in Deuteronomy? It mentions that half were speaking Ashdod. It may have been because half had Ashdod-speaking mothers who taught the children the language they knew. What was disconcerting to Nehemiah was that they could not speak Judean or Hebrew. One author says it means a steady erosion of Israel identity at the level of all thinking and expression, and a loss of access to the Word of God, which would effectively paganize them. A single generation's compromise could undo the work of centuries. How does Nehemiah confront it? Well, he begins by reprimanding or rebuking them, like he did in the two previous paragraphs. He pronounces a curse for breaking an oath on them. He beats and pulls the hair of some of them, which was a sign of humiliation. Perhaps he had authority from the Persian king to do something like this. Perhaps he's responding to strong opposition. Certainly, we recall Isaiah 50, verse 6, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace. So it was a sign of disgrace, even for the suffering servant of Isaiah. Where there's escalation that takes place, begins with contention or confrontation. It moves to pronouncing an oath. It goes on to beating and pulling hair. And finally, in making an oath to forbid future marriage that are mixed. Well, and then there's a lesson history about Solomon and his foreign women. It goes this way: if King Solomon, beloved by God, greatest of all kings, could fail because of women, how much more likely the people in Nehemiah's day? Nehemiah calls it as he sees it. It's to act treacherously. He doesn't mince words or soft pedal the severity of the sin. It was not a matter of freedom of choice, this foreign wife or another wife or a place where people could exercise their preference. It was sin. What were some of the consequences of intermarriage? Well, in verse 28 and 29, desecration or profaning the priesthood. And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Elisha, the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. In-laws who were outlaws. We know Sanballat and we know Tobiah because they are two of the enemies that run through most of the book of Nehemiah. And they're both married to the family of the high priest. They were chased or expelled because they had desecrated or defiled the priesthood, because a high priest could not marry a foreigner. Nehemiah has a certain twist on remember them here, where it's a prayer for God to judge these people rather than for God to remember him. But he goes on to express another remember me prayer in verses 30 through 31. How did Nehemiah want to be remembered? Verse 30, thus I cleansed them from every foreign, and I established the duty of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. What was his legacy? There's no mention of building a wall here. Worship reform seemed to be the main point. He's fixing things that he had reformed earlier. Foreign marriages, support for the work of priests and Levites, the wood offerings, the giving of first fruits. So, was he a failure? Well, from one perspective, the dedication of the wall with a joyful celebration, seemed to be the climax. And here in chapter 13, it seems that things fall apart when he is gone and he's having to put them back together. But notice who Nehemiah is asking to remember him. Not the people, but God. His final concern was to be remembered with favor by God. Amen.